Hi there, and welcome to another Music Ally Focus with me, Music Ally's editor, Joe Sparrow. And in this episode, we're joined by Andrew Batey and Morgan Hayduk from Beatdapp, the streaming analysis platform that aims to uncover streaming fraud. We're going to speak to them about what streaming fraud looks like and who is doing it and why, and the answers will probably surprise you, so stay tuned. Now, what's this Focus podcast? Well, as you know, Music Ally provides an analysis-rich contextual guide to the music business, and each of these focus episodes does something very similar with one meaningful music business story at a time. The podcast is also going to be quick. It's going to take about the same amount of time as Sean Daly of Ireland could hypothetically bounce 2 basketballs simultaneously 15,000 times. He bounced 2 balls 729 times in 60 seconds in 2021. And frankly, I want to know how you discover how you are world-class at bouncing 2 basketballs so fast. But anyway, talking of keeping an eye on lots of fast-moving things, streaming fraud is a big deal. On a simple level, because every stream from a DSP equals a small payment, it's clear that there's an incentive for gaming the system, and that means that money is being siphoned away from real artists. But there's also a bigger, more complex picture, and I spoke to Andrew Batey and Morgan Hayduk to find out more. Beatdapp, their company, is used by big music companies to analyze their streaming data and uncover patterns of use that are indications of streaming fraud. So I wanted to know what the fraud looks like, how big it is, who's doing it and why, how it works, and how on earth they sift through zillions of streams to spot it in the first place. It's a really interesting conversation, so let's jump over now to Andrew and Morgan. Okay, so we're very happy to welcome Andrew Batey and Morgan Hayduk from Beatdapp to the podcast. Hi, Andrew and Morgan.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having us.
We're going to be talking about some of the insights you've gleaned from looking at your data around streaming and implications of fraud and things like that. First of all, can you sort of set the scene for everyone listening, who you are and what Beatdapp does and how what you're doing sort of shone some light and brought this to your attention?
Yeah, we started a few years ago, primarily in the audit space. So the hypothesis, a large label would come to us and said, we're unsure of exactly how many times a song is played. And we think there's some discrepancies in the reporting. So they get a report at the end of the month for their pro rata, percentages. Let's say it says X artist did 100 million plays. They have the regular audit provisions. So 3 years later, they go and audit, and they do, sort of the offline audit where they go and look at 3 different parts, generally subscribers, revenue, and then usage to make sure the usage consumption was correct. Most times they just look at the first 2, to be honest, like subscribers and revenue, because usage is really difficult to dive into. You have to pull the server logs, do a forensic audit on how data maps through their system, then track every single line of code, like that the server, delivered this file. And that's just really intensive. So they started doing that and realized there was these large discrepancies. We'd heard of cases where discrepancies were as high as 31%, but largely in like emerging markets and whatever, like things that were kind of explainable. But all of that, the one insight that we had as we started building this audit tool was that a large percentage of streams that were seemed misallocated were actually fraud being backed out. And so in order to accurately do an audit, you actually have to tackle fraud first. And so what led us to fraud was actually building this really sophisticated audit tool. I mean, we have 30-something patents around being able to transparently track song usage and make sure that everyone's getting the correct number. And that's interesting because Morgan and I have always, and our third co-founder, Poria, we always felt like we wanted to be the third-party trusted source of truth. We never wanted to have a thumb on the scale either way. So we've never taken money from a label. We've never taken money from a DSP. We're completely agnostic and in the middle. And so from that viewpoint, we just want to provide the most clear, transparent data back to all the parties involved. And so when we started seeing this fraud thing, we were like, oh, this is actually a large part of this sort of backed out stream count or this perceived discrepancy. We need to address fraud because without addressing fraud, you can't actually address audit anyway. And so it was interesting. We started with audit, ended up doing fraud, and that really led the company in this direction where how do we become the best at fraud detection so that we can be the best at all these other things later? And so we started looking at fraud, trying to identify all these anomalies or artificial streams. where they're coming from, how they might be persisting. That requires a significant amount of machine learning and AI to understand what's happening. Obviously, access to certain levels of data, and so that's really what I think we've become the best at. Is like we've become the great at fraud detection, and that actually ends up helping everybody in a way that we didn't expect when we first started this company.
Right. So thank you. So for clarity here, someone will come to you and say, "Hey, let's use one song as an example. We have this one song. We've been told that it's had this many streams. We believe it may have more, or we just want to check if that's correct." You do that verification, and you can report back to them and say, "Okay, yes, that song has had 100 million streams. This is correct," or actually, we think it's had more, and that's not correct. And then they can solve that problem.
The original premise of the business was there are now more and more digital platforms using music, like rights holder licensed content, and the sort of historical way, which really dates back to like auditing shipping manifests and pallets of CDs and records, whatever, is that you would, after the fact, you would have a right within your contract to go and audit distribution, which used to be physical, now it's digital primarily. And so it was more about finding a more efficient way to do that process. Like it was an existing process. It was just, at the scale of streaming, it's hard. No one can hire Deloitte, no offense, Deloitte 100 times a year to conduct forensic audits. It's just cost prohibitive and time prohibitive. So that was where we started. But to Andrew's point, the source of the discrepancies, it became pretty clear that it wasn't like malicious or negligence. It was this sort of nebulous concept of artificial streaming, which is defined differently on every platform and defined differently in the eyes of every artist and rights holder. And so getting at that was sort of the insight that led us down the streaming fraud path, because we realized no one's going to feel comfortable about any sort of number that's reported until we have sort of a consensus on what is and isn't artificial streaming. And it's not like it's a static definition. Anyone who's worked in this space, in any other vertical knows that fraudsters change tactics to adapt to the way that the platforms are policed. So that was really the insight for us, is just music is the latest battleground for a kind of older story of internet-based, anomalies and fraud.
So you can imagine that my next question is, how do you define streaming fraud then? If it is this sort of, I'm aware that's a complicated question. As you say, it's this sort of ever mutating thing that everyone views differently. But how do you view fraud, streaming fraud, and what is it doing? How is it done?
I'll take a crack at the definition, because we actually wrote something for our blog and with a partner this week, trying to define it. And it was funny. In trying to define it, we were trying to take a little bit of. I think sometimes when you think about artificial streaming, it really gets boiled down to like manipulating perception of success or popularity. And the reality is, there's also this whole other sort of like criminal element to this, which is there are people who just look at the internet as a big pot of money that can be stolen from if you can figure out how to hack it. And so it isn't just about musicians competing for top placement on charts or playlists. It's actually like streaming is just another digital platform that can be hacked. So we wrote down as sort of a definition, and I think definitions are always controversial and usually wrong as soon as you say them out loud. So with that caveat, we said streaming fraud is when an individual or group leverages bots, stolen accounts, or manipulated platform features to alter the perception of their own commercial success and or steal streaming income that otherwise belongs to every legitimate artist, music industry professional, and rights holder. And so in that definition, you kind of get at the two things that I think drive this, right? One is perception, and that is certainly part of it. But the other bigger part is actually stealing the streaming income. And there are lots of different ways to do that, and lots of different ways to, like, tactics to, accomplish those ends. But those tend to be the two big buckets that drive most of this activity.
Right. So it's an artist or someone around an artist bumping up numbers to make them look more successful, and it's somebody scamming the system to make some money. And those are two different, slightly different things, of course. First of all, then, in a sort of maybe a technological sense, or in this physical sense, how is this done?
Yeah, this is it's like whack-a-mole. There are so many ways it's done. We've seen some crazy stuff. I think that I'm no longer surprised at the creativity of hackers or fraudsters. I think that so in the easiest sense, there's the ones that are easy to catch are, let's say, streaming farms where there's like, thousands of phones on a wall that are playing songs they're told to play, or human networks where I hire Morgan to give me 1 million streams. Morgan turns around and hires 10 people to give him 100,000 streams. That person turns around and hires 100 people to give 1,000 streams. That person turns around and gives 10 people to go. And it's hard to track because it's like this phone tree of people who are driving in a similar direction once they're told from the top of the chain. So those you need to see kind of like these. You look for sort of intertangled accounts that are mirroring each other, but still might be people. They're not necessarily bots. Like everyone assumes bots. That's not always the case. Sometimes it's cheaper and easier to set up a network of people. So that's interesting.
Which is in itself is a bit sobering, isn't it? A bunch of people are cheaper than a bot.
Sometimes, yeah, it's crazy. And so that's an interesting thing. But I'd say more commonly what we see a lot is hijacked accounts. So if you're a streaming service, like your job is to deliver the best possible content and the experience to someone trying to listen to music, right? And so you want to remove things that like friction. So when I go to sign up, you have social sign-ons. Like I should be able to sign up with Google, Facebook, whatever. Like I should be able to sign in using single sign-on with one of these providers, so I don't have to create all these accounts. I don't have to constantly change, remember my passwords, whatever. The problem is those are all attack vectors. So like when Facebook was breached and 500 million accounts became public, it's not hard to get on the dark web today and just go pull 3 million accounts and then just try out different services with those accounts. Like, did they social sign on to Pandora? Like whoever, it doesn't even matter. I don't know that Pandora has that specific integration. I'm just throwing a name out. But my and we had done a panel with them, so they're top of mind. But like what I'm thinking of, what I'm trying to say is that, like, generally speaking, those are all things that make it easier as a consumer to listen to music and create a frictionless environment where you can become you listen to the best content you can in the easiest way, and it's a great experience for you as the consumer. The downside is that every time you introduce one of these potential vectors, that's a new angle of attack for a fraudster to hack. And it's not even like they're hacking your system. They hack Facebook, or at some point somebody got hacked. PayPal, like whoever it is, like there's lots of attack vectors. And it's with the dark web today, you can get online, and I can get online today and buy 1 million accounts on any top tier DSP, like the login credentials.
How much would that cost, out of interest?
It changes. And the reason it's so cheap, like pennies per account or whatever. But the reason that it's cheap is that, like, think of it this way. If I have 1 million, if I have, let's say 100 million accounts, I can't log into 100 million accounts. The reason this happens in PayPal all the time. Actually, I'll use PayPal as the fraud case here. If you're PayPal and you've exposed accidentally 100 million accounts of people that have money in their accounts, I, as the fraudster, can't go log into 100 million accounts without it coming back to me. Like, I am the central source from which all of these requests come from. So what I have to do as a hacker is split that into a bunch of small account like grouping. So like, let's say 100 or 200 and sell them each for like 3 cents on the dollar, and say, hey, hacker, do you want to go steal $1? You pay me 3 cents. I give you 97 cents. And here's the 100 accounts you do, because they won't catch you doing 100, but they'll catch me trying to do 100 million. So I sell all of these account permissions to everybody else for pennies, because I can't possibly extract that much value as one single person. The same thing happens with all these accounts that are hacked on Facebook and like Google or whoever. Like when you go on the dark web, you can buy them so cheap because no single individual generally can exploit the value. But when you have bots that you can spread out across everywhere, you can potentially do that. And in this case, there's no real perceived harm because you're not stealing money right off the bat. Like, I'm not logging in PayPal. That's 100% theft. Like, I'm logging into someone else's account and sending $10 to some other account, right? Like, or taking the money out. In streaming, like, a lot of these guys don't really view it as fraud at first because they're thinking, oh, it's just a social sign-on account. Like, who cares? Like, okay, so you want to listen to free Spotify music? Like, no one, like if you look at it from that view, it's like they're not really. So what? I gave someone a free Spotify. I gave someone my Netflix access, whatever, like it doesn't seem like a big deal. But the difference is that these bots in aggregate change market share percentages and pro rata payouts and can extract pennies from small, from hundreds of thousands of accounts, which aggregate to a large amount of money for the fraudster.
It's a bit like the plot point in Superman 3. I think, which we can all relate to, which is it's thousands of a penny many times by streaming again and again and again, and you divert that money to somewhere else, and then you have some real money. Yeah. So that's really interesting. What then is the impact? Let's go back to artists and labels. What is the impact, or even streaming platforms? What's the impact from that perspective of people working in the music industry? First of all, what effect does it have potentially in terms of the legitimacy of their numbers and the consequences for the money they earn, for instance?
I really like this question because there's something in it for everyone, and I think that's the part that, like, when we talk about this, it's not purely a DSP problem, although it certainly is, because it's happening on their platforms and it's affecting the integrity of the algorithms that generate recommendations. I mean, you think about any algorithmically generated playlist that is personalized to you, the impact of fraudulent streaming on the recommendations those playlists, those algorithms generate for those playlists is real. And so that's a consumer harm problem on streaming services. You also have your most important partners and the rights holders who want to be paid the correct pro rata share. And part of your job is to make sure you're adjudicating things the right way so that those pro rata percentages aren't affected. But if they are, that hurts the labels, it hurts the publishers, it hurts the artists themselves, the songwriters, and everybody else, honestly, who makes a living in the industry, because so much of, I think, decisions that are made outside of streaming are influenced by streaming numbers, right? Like the likelihood that you're going to headline Coachella is directly tied back to the numbers that you generated on previous tours, but also on streaming. And maybe not even headline, but just getting on that, the third stage on the first night is the last slot.
Yeah. People
are going to look at social presence and streaming numbers and try to back into, like, is this person, a popular act or an emerging act that's going to draw a crowd? And so if they don't get that fair shot because someone else has manipulated numbers, even if it's not an artist, even if it's just someone juicing numbers to try to extract the royalties, but that alters the perception of someone's legitimate success, that sucks. And that's a huge problem for the industry. So there's, the artist harm, the label harm, the publisher, DSP. And then, to the earlier point about click farms, there's also just like this whole world of sort of abstracted away from music, but that just exists to do things like click fraud, right? And it's not just a music problem, it's an advertising problem everywhere else. But there's a great article from maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I can't remember the publication it was in. And it was an interview with somebody who worked at a click farm in the Philippines. And he was describing how awful his day was to this journalist and saying, if we don't hit our click quota, they turn the fans off on us. And like, right. So all of a sudden it's not just, the music industry, but it's this whole sort of outside ecosystem that exists to propel bad behavior. And I think, from our point of view, as sort of like an ethos, there's like a belief in artists and the music industry as a whole, but there's also like, let's not be a forum to allow this like terrible behavior that affects people in other parts of the world that we really don't even think about until someone like shoves an article like that in our face. Let's combat this for them too. So I think the harm question is pretty far reaching.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing when you abstract it out that far and, you think about, oh yeah, there are some people at the end of this chain that are suffering as a consequence of someone juicing numbers. So let's think about this in a second. What I'd like to just look at is just to break that into those two buckets that you mentioned in terms of there's people doing fraud like that, which is to generate money, the Superman 3 premise. But then I want to look at this one about fraudulent behavior, which is around sort of juicing numbers for perception. 10 years ago in a previous life, I was a radio plugger, and to be honest, I knew that when I was going to go and plug artists to radio stations, at that time, the first thing they would ask is, how many streams is this song getting on SoundCloud or whatever? And now I didn't do this, by the way, but I knew people who would, the week before people would go and plug the song to radio, they would invest $30 or whatever and bump those numbers really high so it looked really good, and it would have an impact on whether that song got played on radio or not. Is there any evidence of this happening for mainstream artists where there's some sort of manipulation going on of number perception on streaming platforms?
I'd say two things on this. One, like we have a view of like a percentage of the market, not the whole thing. So nothing we say can be, definitive. And I know that's sort of a hedge, but I think it's an important one because we haven't seen at the top of the market very much. Like at sort of like the household name artist is not who shows up in the fraud model, or the fraud models that we're seeing right now. What's interesting is that there are examples of content fraud. So think about it as like someone uploading music that actually belongs to someone else under, in some cases, the original artist's name, but with the metadata pointing back to a non-owner. We see that. Right. We had a case recently where like a household name DJ who the overwhelming majority of their streams were being diverted to the wrong content owner. The audio was identical. So it had clearly evaded the filter somehow on the content recognition side, and everything about the release was the same except for the distributor and obviously the rights holder. And so we didn't catch it because we were looking for that artist. We caught it because the users that were listening to that particular version of those songs showed up in our fraud models as suspicious users. And then we looked at the content they were consuming and discovered, oh, this isn't actually the right release for this DJ. And there was a whole network of streams that were happening under the service that were targeting him. That version of the release was being surfaced as the first one when you search for that DJ organically. So you had like, I tell that story because it's a super interesting example, I think, of where, top of market artists are impacted, but like not in the way you would think. He wasn't fighting for perception. It was actually like diverting income the wrong way away from him. So there's definitely some there are stories that you can go and find from some pretty great journalists out there who've written stories about managers and folks getting caught trying to buy streams for first week releases and sales. And like, I think that's always going to happen. I think there's a bit of an arms race in that sense, but we see a lot more of it on the sort of like financially motivated fraud side than we do on the like top of market perception side, which is interesting.
The other thing I'll throw in there too is that a lot of times these bigger artists, if they do get quote unquote caught, they're holding the bag, but they might not have been the one that was perpetuated. They weren't the ones like starting the fraud. So like if I'm trying to hide my fraud, I need to hide in plain sight, which means I need to make it look like if I'm targeting Morgan, I have to make all the rest of my listens look normal. I can't just target Morgan or it's too obvious. That means I need to pull top 40 artists across the like similar DSPs from the right distributors. So that if I'm looking at it from the top line, I'm seeing, oh, most of this person's streams are what you would expect, like these type of artists and these genres from these providers. And so the downside is sometimes if I'm like a pervasive fraudster, really pushing Morgan as a small sliver. If I want to drive Morgan, let's say 100 million plays, I have to create, let's say, 1 billion plays of noise. And that noise needs to look.
And that goes to other artists,
correct,
whose numbers are lifted in order to artificially lift.
But what the headline that comes out is like X artist, caught streaming fraud. But like they might not have actually even known this was happening because they were just a victim of somebody else's fraud. So like.
Right, and of course, from their perspective, fine, because they've had more streams registered that has paid them more, right? So they're not going to. That's not their fault, and they've actually benefited from it. But that means that money that would have legitimately gone to other people has been diverted away from them, I guess, as a consequence.
On the short term, yes, you would say that, but actually, what happens is like because it's spread across so many different providers and so many distributors, plus the fraud they're injecting in between. What ends up happening is shifts market share for everybody. So like you would look at that and say, oh, like X label must love this. They actually don't love that because all the other stuff they're doing legitimately gets deep. It actually, like if you look at a longer scope, they actually lose market share from all this activity because it's not like it's only targeting them. So like the net effect is negative for almost everybody. It's not a positive except for the fraudster. But on the surface, you would say, oh, that looks like it benefits, whoever artist, but it actually doesn't. It does not benefit them long term.
Okay, and just to jump in here, if you're finding this useful and you'd like more of this in-depth news and trusted analysis waiting for you in your inbox every morning, as well as access to all of our industry-leading reports, head on over to musically.com/subscribe. And you, yes, you may be eligible for a free Music Ally subscription via our corporate and sponsored subscriptions. So if you work for a DSP, a major label, an indie label, or if you're an artist manager, an employee of a CMO or a publisher, you can check to see if it's available for you. It's musically.com/subscription-options. There's a link below the podcast to check out as well. Okay, let's go back to the interview. Who should be stopping this? I mean, I guess you could, the simple thing, it seems, would be to point the finger at the platforms that are using music and say, hey, just stop fraud. But we can tell clearly, immediately, it's a lot harder than that.
Yeah.
So what needs to be done beyond, auditing and tracking these things down using technology? What is there anything that could be simply done or relatively simply done to dampen the opportunities for this?
Of course. We took a fair amount of inspiration for what we've built from other industries and verticals to have similar dynamics. So e-commerce, financial services, banking online, digital advertising have faced similar, not identical, slightly different dynamics, slightly different incentives, but similar challenges with fraud online. And when you look at what those industries typically do, is they consolidate around a third party, or in some cases, a series of third parties, depending on how big the industry is. But in our case, in music, we think it really makes sense for there to be one. And I know that's a self-serving answer, but there's a reason for it. And it's that if you're looking for something that's, subtle, and the more sophisticated, more nuanced fraud is just that, it's subtle, you have to look across a bigger data set than just one individual DSPs. And so the question of, what could the DSPs do? I actually don't think there's a lot they can do, and they're doing a lot of it themselves. But the bigger challenge is, how do you build the aggregate data set of the industry that lets you have a view across platforms over time to find the subtle patterns that emerge when you look at that big, robust, and sort of constantly replenishing data set. And that's where we think we come in, because you're never going to see a world where Spotify, SoundCloud, and Tencent openly just have a shared database of streaming volume. And
I was going to say, the music industry is not well known for sharing its data widely.
And you know what? One of the things that's I think is good heartening for the industry is, think about banking as another good example. There's a company in Canada. We don't just reference them because we're Canadian, but it helps. They do financial services fraud detection. They're called Verifin. Their first product was a cross-institutional analysis product that basically took pooled data at the transaction level from multiple banks and looked for instances of money laundering and other sort of fraudulent activity in that shared data set. And you can imagine that Citibank and RBC and Scotiabank and JP Morgan definitely do not share their customer level transaction data willingly among one another, but they do in the context of combating fraud, and they do it through a third party, which happens to be Verifin. And we look at that model and say, look, if it can work in banking, and that's the most sensitive data on the planet, it can definitely work in streaming, also very sensitive data, but can be shared. There's a precedent for this. And when it is, the fraud detection tools work much more efficiently.
To wrap this up then, I mean, this is clearly like you said, whack-a-mole. This is a constantly mutating system. You're dealing, essentially, it sounds like people trying to game the system to make money is the main issue here, rather than sort of vanity metrics. So where does this go? This, as the music industry and the DSPs get bigger and recorded music incomes from DSPs get bigger, this is going to be a bigger problem, right? So where does this go, and where are we in terms of tipping the balance towards the good guys?
I think that, look, we have a really large, robust team that's dedicated to this, just like DSPs are dedicated to providing the best experience for listening to music. I think we're providing the best possible tools to combat fraud. And so where I think this goes, and where we're seeing a lot of it go, is we have a lot of DSPs that are quietly using our service, signing up, giving us the data we need to help them with fraud. We protect all their data, so their data is never shared. We use top standards, our Amazon Well Architecture review, the way that and the NSA suggests that you separate data and sort of secure it. We've been penetration tested. We take security seriously to make sure data is never leaked and or even has the potential to get to competitors. So we treat all of that kind of in silos and then build our tools across. So our models keep getting smarter, but we aren't necessarily combining or sharing their data with each other. So like that's like the key thing there. But where it goes is I think it's whack-a-mole, and we just keep building models. We have 50 models now. We'll have over 100 by the end of this year. We constantly find new ways, like our unsupervised models will find new ways of fraud we didn't know existed. Then we build supervised models to go and find that fraud again. So like we are constantly evolving. Ideally, we become the largest data set and models fighting fraud for this, but we make it so hard that the fraudsters just like, if you make it so difficult, they'll just pick a different industry and move on. Like eventually, like if the bar becomes so hard to defraud music, they'll just look at video. Like they'll go somewhere else. Yeah. They'll say, okay, like it's the same tools. Like we're targeting X industry now because there's more profit to be made. Yeah. Like it's not like they're, you just can't make it easy. You just have to make those pathways so difficult. And I think at some point, it becomes really like, then you're just catching a small group of really sophisticated people. But by and large, most of the fraud can be eradicated.
So you could eradicate the vast majority of it, and they can shift over to scamming people out of their NFTs or something like that instead.
Exactly.
I hear is pretty easy. I mean, this is a really fascinating insight into something perhaps we don't really think about very much in the music industry, but is obviously clearly incredibly important. So I'll put a link to that blog post that you mentioned next to the podcast, and you can read that, and a link to Beatdapp. So thank you very much, Andrew and Morgan, for this insight.
Thanks for having us on, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
And there we go. So if you found that useful, please share this podcast on with someone else who you think will also get something out of it. And if you'd like to email me and give me your thoughts, it's joe@musically.com. That's joe@musically.com. Don't forget, we have a free weekly email called The Knowledge, which rounds up a bit of this and a bit of that of the best analysis, news, marketing, insight, and skills from Music Ally. There's a link below the podcast, so sign up and impress your boss. And don't forget as well, you can check out to see if you are eligible for a free Music Ally subscription. That link is also beneath the podcast. So that's it from me, Joe Sparrow. Until next time, farewell.